Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you all for welcoming me. It seems perhaps a slightly strange moment in world history for anybody to invite an American scholar to talk about the conjunction of democracy and war, much less to talk about military proficiency, but be that as it may. I'd like to thank the University of Sydney and especially the Research Institute in Humanities and Social Science, which has been my host for the last delightful and instructive couple of weeks. The School of Philosophy and Social Inquiry here at University of Sydney, which has given me quarters and presented me with a series of delightful interchanges. The Department of Classics and Ancient History, and especially my colleague David Pritchard for organizing this entire conference and this special session. Well, there is a handout that you should have in hand. If you don't, you can sort of look on someone who has it. It's not essential, but it will sort of help you to follow along. I'm not going to go through everything on this handout, but it's sort of meant to be filling in the blanks and potentially be something you can look at after the lecture if you think there's anything worth following up on. Well, as Dan Reiter and Alan Sam have demonstrated in a recent book on the topic of democracy at war, in the 19th and the 20th centuries, democracies proved to be unexpectedly good at the business of war. Good in that democracies win more often than they lose, and unexpected in that aristocratic writers, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville, had regarded democratic culture as being incapable of instilling military virtues. Democratic success at war is also unexpected in light of contemporary social science theories of rational choice and collective action. First, because of their emphasis on individual initiative and freedom, democracies seem especially vulnerable to free riders, that is, selfish social defectors who seek to benefit from others' social cooperation. Next, democracies seem not to be very good at building stable coalitions. Because democratic governmental authority is not centered in a unitary sovereign, democracies face problems with making treaty commitments credible to other powers, a point harped upon, by the way, by the anonymous Athenian writer known as the Old Oligarch in the 5th century BC. Nor should democracies be good at implementing strategic plans or carrying out field operations. Democratic culture blurs the principal-to-agent relation between policymakers and military services and between military commanders and troops in the field. Democracy undercuts the hierarchical system of command and control on which military success is thought to depend, or at least so it seems. Historians of ancient Greece lack Reiter and Sam's detailed database, so I cannot say whether Greek democracies overall outperformed oligarchies and tyrannies in military operations. Yet if we start with the presumption that highly participatory direct democracies ought not, on principle, do very well in war, the conjunction of democratic government and military proficiency in certain leading Greek states becomes a striking feature of classical Greek history. Athens in the period 508 to 415 BC and Syracuse in 465 to 412 BC were both democratic and highly successful militarily. Now, this does not, of course, mean that Greek democracies always won or that non-democratic city-states were particularly bad at war. After all, Syracusan tyrants successfully dominated much of Sicily, oligarchic Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, and monarchical Macedon eventually overwhelmed the city-states. But we do need to explain how democratic Athens managed to dominate the Aegean for much of the 5th century and why Athens was finally stopped by democratic Syracuse. Well, there are various explanations for why, despite their apparent disadvantages in respect to collective action, credible commitment, and principal-agent relations, why democracies do relatively well at war. Explanations tend to center on three factors of mobilization, morale, and leadership. The so-called bargaining hypothesis suggests that democracies will be able to mobilize large numbers of troops by offering the privileges of citizenship in exchange for military service. With larger armies at their disposal, so goes the theory, democracies can expect to do better. Democratic armies may have superior morale because fighting men have a stake in society, because they manifest, as Ryan Ballett suggests, a rational form of courage, or because, as Victor Hansen has asserted, the ideological goals of democratic wars of liberation are enthusiastically endorsed by men under arms. Reiter and Sam, by contrast, focus on leadership and accountability. Because they're accountable to voters, democratic leaders are less likely to start wars that they may lose, and the democratic emphasis on individuality means that democracy's soldiers fight with greater initiative and under leaders chosen for their merit. But the question arises, should we be looking uniquely at political and military explanations like mobilization, morale, and leadership, or might we be able to identify a higher order explanatory variable for democratic military success? If some democracies are more militarily successful than expected, they are also surprisingly economically successful. Surprising, that is, in light of the problems I alluded to above of free riding, credible commitment, and hierarchy. Although it remains impossible to compare the material well-doing of Greek polis on a per capita basis, we can capture overall polis performance on various measures that, in the aggregate, can be taken as indicative of the state's economic success. Over the last year, I've been compiling some statistics, and you'll be deeply relieved to know that I'm not going to bother you with those numbers today. Suffice it to say that democratic Athens beats its polis rivals on all measures of general flourishing. And a simple way to express this is to note that democratic Athens performs at about 5 standard deviations above the mean performance level of the 80 most successful Greek polis. Aren't you glad there isn't going to be any more of that? So democratic Athens was, at least for a good part of its history, more successful militarily and economically than might be expected. If we look at the history of Athens across the period 508 to 322 BC, that is the democratic period, neither military success nor economic success is persuasive as an explanatory variable. So if we cannot claim that Athens was economically successful because it was military successful, or that Athens was militarily successful because it was economically successful, we need to seek some third factor. The success of certain democracies in the realms of war and economy can be seen as parts of the general phenomenon of democratic flourishing. General democratic flourishing provides a context for Athenian military success in the early and mid-5th centuries. The mobilization, morale, leadership, military success package certainly helps us to explain why Athens did as well as it did in military conflicts with rivals, but military success is part of a larger story. Well, cutting to the chase, I propose knowledge as an overarching explanation for the phenomenon of unexpected democratic success. By knowledge, this is on your handout, by the way, I mean the organization of useful information for purposes of social action through processes of innovation and learning. And I'll try to make it clear what I mean by that in the bulk of this talk. But I'm talking about the organization of useful information rather than, for example, justified true belief. My claim is that every purposeful organization, including every Greek polis, faces the problem of organizing what its membership collectively knows. One way to draw attention to this is the perhaps apocryphal claim by Lou Platt, the former CEO of the Hewlett-Packard Corporation, who is believed to have quipped or said to have quipped, "If only Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knows, we would be 3 times as profitable." And That's actually on your handout. And by this he means that the organization as an organization has a difficult time capturing what all the members of the organization individually know. So if we could capture what we know collectively, we would do a whole lot better. And I think that's basically true. It's through processes of organized knowledge that better or worse decisions are made, that subsequently they're subsequently well or poorly executed, and preserved or lost to collective memory. My claim is that Athens is an example of a democracy that was very good at organizing what its residents knew and at employing that organized knowledge for purposes of problem solving. And this can be stated as a general hypothesis, once again on your handout. That is, inefficiencies introduced by Athens' participatory political practices were overbalanced by returns to social cooperation resulting from knowledge organized in the context of democratic institutions and culture. This enhanced capacity for knowledge organization was, I'd argue, a key aspect of Athenian success in various domains, including war. Democratic military success is, I'd argue, best thought of as a specific instance of the general phenomenon of successful democratic problem solving by the organization of useful knowledge. Well, the general hypothesis can be tested by assessing distinctive Athenian institutional processes for strategically addressing three fundamental problems faced by all states. This is, once again, on your handout on Table 1. The three problems and their solutions are related in that the solution to each problem involves integrating social knowledge with technical knowledge. Moreover, each of the three problems is an aspect of the general collective action dilemma. That is to say, how can the knowledge and judgment possessed by individuals be brought together in the service of a collective social good? And how, in the language of game theory, can this result be stabilized as an equilibrium, such that each self-seeking individual has no more advantageous move to make in the game? How, in brief, can a democracy deal with the tendency of rationally self-interested individuals to free ride on the benefits of other people's social cooperation? Table 1 on your handout sums up these three knowledge organization problems and their solutions according to the processes of collection, coordination, and codification by which they were addressed at Athens. Once again, as David mentioned, this paper is part of a larger project, and so in some ways what I'm giving you on that table sums up the conclusions of that larger project. Well, so far my argument's been pretty abstract, yet if it is to have value for Greek history, it must be able to explain actual events. So we turn to the historian Thucydides' contemporary description of military operations in the first part of the Peloponnesian War, the period known as the Archidamian War. Thucydides was very concerned with collective action and the problem of free riding. He saw that opportunities for free riding were, to an extent, regime-specific. By expanding the range of choices available to free citizens, and by eliminating social sanctions typical of traditional face-to-face Greek communities, democracy in the Athenian style also expanded opportunities for free riders. Moreover, the relationship between the political regime and the organization of useful knowledge is, for Thucydides, integrally related to the problem of collective political action, especially in democracies like Athens. Along with his concern for explaining the role played by the choices of leaders and the power-seeking behavior of states, Thucydides explored the social effects of political institutions. He shows his readers why certain polis with democratic institutions did better in competition with their rivals than might otherwise have been expected. This positive institutional effect on democratic performance was, in Thucydides' analysis, in large part due to the technical innovation and social learning associated with the organization of useful knowledge. In his assessment of Pericles at Book 12, Section 65, Thucydides offers a retrospective of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides is at pains to show that Athens could have won the war. He notes that Pericles was confident that Athens would prevail if the Athenians avoided foolish strategic errors. Thucydides makes it clear that in his view, Pericles was correct in his assessment because of Athens' superiority in human and material resources. Thucydides explains early in his history how the sources of Athenian greatness had been identified and built up under thoughtful leaders, especially Themistocles and Pericles. The two speeches by Pericles to the Athenian assembly in Thucydides' text focus on Athenian resources and the importance of national cohesion. Much of the latter part of Thucydides' history recounts how those extraordinary resources were subsequently squandered. The fault is laid at the door of inferior post-Pericles leaders who proved incapable of controlling a willful demos, a willful population. But that failure of leadership was exacerbated in Thucydides' account by the degeneration of the high level of willed social cooperation that had characterized Athens in the era of Pericles' leadership. Well, here we focus first on Thucydides' assessment of the habits of behavior that allowed Athens to arrive at its position of preeminence in the years before the outbreak of the war, and then his account of the complex and effective Athenian military operations in the early years of the war. Thucydides' narrative demonstrates that democratic Athens had grown to a position of greatness in the Greek world because the Athenians proved capable of identifying and consistently capturing the benefits of social cooperation among a population of free citizens, each of whom was rationally seeking his own advantages and making choices accordingly. The result of the Athenian alignment of rational individual good-seeking and political common good-seeking was a record of state growth fueled by successful innovation across a range of political endeavors, from the development of a great naval empire to a sophisticated and ambitious program of public architecture to the efflorescence of intellectual, artistic, and performance culture. Cooperation was encouraged by ideological as well as by institutional means. Athenians were convinced, both by the rhetoric of their leaders and by the evidence of growing Athenian power and wealth, that acting in the common good was indeed conducive to the benefit of each individual. Free riding was discouraged by new legal sanctions, while informal cultural sanctions took on new forms in the democratic institutional context of the people's courts and the citizen assembly. Meanwhile, the Athenian state developed new ways to aggregate what its diverse membership knew, to coordinate action across that diverse membership, and to codify useful knowledge. The net result of the Athenian socio-political system, as depicted by Thucydides, was to foster the military and economic potential of a high-performing polis, one that excited wonder and fear among its Greek rivals. Now, this is only part of the story. We must never forget that Thucydides is also concerned with an institutionalized Athenian tendency to error and with how Athenian potential was squandered. But he clearly wanted his readers, us, to understand why democratic Athens had been so capable of flourishing in the hyper-competitive environment of the Greek city-states. Well, in a well-known passage in Book 1 of Thucydides' history, it's on your handout, ambassadors from Corinth urged their Spartan allies to declare war upon Athens by describing the underlying character of the Athenian people. Although this dramatic and rhetorically elegant description of the Athenian character is put in the mouths of Athens' enemies, its basic points are substantially confirmed in the course of Thucydides' history. I think the Corinthian assessment, as I'll call it, captures a lot of why Thucydides thought Athens was successful, and stripped of the rhetorical embellishments, it's a fair description of how Athens performed when the democratic polis was at the top of its game. The passage focuses on three key Athenian characteristics and blends these into a kind of character portrait of the highly productive and overall successful polis. A polis that is, I think, in some ways reasonable to call modern. Of course, that's not a term Thucydides uses, but I think one of the ways to think about the way that Thucydides is describing, or that Thucydides' Corinthians are describing Athens, is as a modern state in contrast with traditional states, the other Greek city-states, which really hadn't arrived at this level of sort of cultural and institutional modernity that Athens had arrived at. Once again, I'm obviously not using modern as a chronological term here, but as a kind of a conceptual term. Okay, well, the Corinthian assessment is summed up in the first column of Table 2, or the Corinthian assessment of Athens. According to Thucydides' Corinthians, Athenians manifest three success-related characteristics. First, they're agile, fast, innovative, and flexible. By seamlessly conjoining deliberation with action, they accomplish their designs more quickly than expected. They're technically advanced, experienced, and constantly seek to increase technical capacity by refining their skills and finding new uses for them. Next, they're ambitious. They're resilient risk-takers, dissatisfied with current possessions and accomplishments, believing they can always do and get more. They take pleasure in hard work. They willingly face danger and are undeterred when certain of their enterprises fail. They're restless, future-oriented, outward-looking, and do not spend much time resting at home or crying over spilt milk. Finally, they're common end seekers. They cooperatively sacrifice short-term individual and private goods for the long-term common advantage of the polis. So, modern Athens. Although the Athenians appear in one sense unique in their modernity, they are also, in the Corinthian estimation, exemplary. Because of their foreign policy successes, the Athenian behavioral style was coming to define the cutting edge of contemporary Greek political culture. The thrust of the Corinthians' critical contrast between the agile, ambitious, and rationally cooperative Athenians and the slow, complacent, and self-centered Spartans is that those who are unwilling or unable to adopt Athenian methods are doomed to be left behind in the race for preeminence. Well, Thucydides' subsequent narrative events complicates this scenario, and each of the positive Athenian attributes turns out to have a negative corollary. These are listed in Table 2 on Column 3. Negative factors were exacerbated by the changing environment of interstate competition. The power gained through Athens' hard work and productivity led to the growth of fear among other states, especially Sparta. A growing realization that allowing Athenian power to grow unchecked would result in their own permanent eclipse. With this realization came increasing willingness to take risks by challenging Athenian hegemony. Moreover, although Athens enjoyed a clear technical advantage in the early stages of the war, Athens' rivals eventually caught on. Thucydides' narrative repeatedly demonstrates that Athens had no monopoly on technical innovation. Thucydides suggests that at the end of the war, the negative internal Athenian factors, in conjunction with the ability of Athens' rivals to take risks, build coalitions, and learn from the Athenian example, led to Athens' failure to fulfill the well-grounded expectations of Pericles. It remains true, however, that Thucydides' historical narrative also demonstrates the general validity of the Corinthian portrait. Despite their mistakes, and in the absence of Periclean leadership, the Athenians proved to be formidable opponents to the Spartans until the end of the war. What is it that accounts for the emergence and persistence of Athenian agility, ambition, and common good seeking? For Thucydides' Corinthians, these three core attributes were simply facts of Athenian character. Athenians were just naturally agile, ambitious, and rationally cooperative, in the same way that Spartans were naturally slow, risk-averse, and self-centered, in column 2 of Table 2. But for Thucydides and his intended readers, us, innate national character is an inadequate explanation for the behavior typical of a given human community. In Thucydides' history, one key to explaining behavioral traits is political culture. Political culture is in turn learned behavior arising from a community's political and legal institutions and its established political practices. This political explanation of Athenian exceptionalism is to the fore in the famous funeral oration of Pericles in Thucydides' Book 2. In two important passages, once again, they're in extended form on your handout, Pericles asserts that Athens is characterized by a culture of open access, and he describes the Athenian participatory decision-making process. Well, these passages bear directly on social choice and the organization of useful knowledge at Athens. Pericles implies that in stark contrast to the paranoiac, secretive, and discipline-obsessed Spartans, Athenians enjoy an equal opportunity to learn from all those public sources that render the city a common possession, as well as an equal opportunity to share the fruits of their own learning. Pericles embraces the notion that there is no standard Athenian civic curriculum, nor specialized institutions for teaching courage. All that is learned by free citizens as part of their life in a free city. Nor are there any pre-established criteria for assuming the role of public teacher. It's simply a matter of manifesting a demonstrable excellence, a matter of possessing political skills and sharing such knowledge as benefits the society as a whole. The burden of Pericles' speech is that democratic Athens is distinctively meritocratic, distinctively free and open, and distinctively great. Pericles describes Athens as a community of responsible, self-interested individuals. He asserts that politically relevant knowledge is indeed widespread among Athenian citizens, even among those who focus primarily upon their own affairs.